Okay, so thank you all for coming to the Paul Pratt Memorial Library's uh, Grow into Summer event. Today's guest speaker is Chris Kennedy from Kennedy Country Gardens in Scituate, Massachusetts. We'll be talking about gardening in the pandemic. Chris is a third generation gardener at the Scituate facility. And I think we all know you and have seen you in shop there. Got some wonderful plants there. I want to thank our sponsors today, the Community Garden Club of Cohasset. As I said, this is going to be recorded, and I would suggest if you have questions to go ahead and type them in the chat feature. If you have a specific question to your property, perhaps Chris will be able to email you directly about that. But why don't I just pass over the mic to you, Chris?
Awesome. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Hear me, Gail? Thank you very much. This is an honor. Wow, this is a lot of people. We have 90 plus people. That's pretty exciting. I'm assuming that the timing is well timed here. We were originally going to do this last spring and it was canceled. And now because we have a pandemic, we have it via Zoom, and I bet we have 3 or 4 times the amount of people because we don't have to drive and commute and show up. So the pandemic is changing how we do things in general. And one of the things I wanted to talk about today is, some general garden related themes, but also how the pandemic has kind of affected the gardening world. And I'll kind of try to tie it in as we go through the presentation. Some of you may have seen me speak before, and this is kind of a similar version of what I've done other times, but I will try to, make it a little bit different and make it as interesting as I can. And, try to customize it to coastal gardening, which we're all familiar with in Cohasset and the Salt Shore. So yeah, well, let me start. Let's see if I can get my presentation to move. There it goes. All right. So I'll do a brief introduction. We'll talk about the pandemic and the effects of gardening and in the garden center business. We'll do a little garden and design 101, and then we can do some question and answer. And like we said previous, we can hold as many questions as we can, unless it's very specific to what we're talking about now, till the end. And if they're general questions, we'll take them. And then if you have any more specific questions, I'd be happy to take them via email, and my email's on the screen right there. And of course, I want to thank the Community Garden Club of Cohasset. You guys are all you ladies are fantastic. We have done many things together, including doing some work at some of the schools and some programs around town. So happy to work with you all as well. I think the role of a garden club is very vital to continuing gardening and sharing knowledge is such a huge thing. And most of us have learned from friends and our parents about gardening, and a garden club kind of helps fill that void when we don't have the answers. So those of us that work at garden centers, we're happy to certainly help fill in the void as well. Okay, a little bit about me and my family. We moved into Cohasset in 2008. That's my wife, Amanda, my son, Brooks, and my daughter, Riley, and my dog, Mookie. You might see me around town. I'm coaching basketball and doing all kinds of other things for the town. We have fun with this. When we moved here, my daughter on the right, you can see her belly sticking out in the garden. She was not born. We moved to Cohasset. My son was just 2. We absolutely love this town. We live behind the CVS area, in that neighborhood behind CVS and on Ledgewood Drive. Hopefully someday I can share my garden. Like all gardens, it's in the works. I'm almost ready to maybe share it now that I've been there a few years. This is a fundraiser we were involved with. This is us doing boxwood trees in my daughter's class. similar to what the garden club does. We get very active. This is my daughter on the left. I think I may have dragged her to work that day. That might have been Easter last year to help us out. And my son planting in front of Cohasset Middle School with his friend Grayson. And we do the planters at the library. I do this with the rec department and with the library, and we trade. You can see my daughter, we get our name on the t-shirt, the camp t-shirt. So it's kind of a small town. It's a fun town, and we love supporting each other. This is just a little win-win program that we do. And you can see my son on the left. He is planting in front of, that's Deer Hill School, and he's bringing flowers for the teachers, I think, in daycare. So my kids have kind of grown up in the business. My daughter on the left gets dragged to work quite often, and now that she's older, she doesn't have to, but I'm trying to figure out if she wants to get involved, and my son wants to get involved, so they can be maybe the fourth generation. I grew up, of course, in the business. This is me at Christmas time. This is me driving the delivery van at, I don't know what age that was. It looks like maybe 3, 2. But we start early. This is the only job I've ever had. I met my wife at Penn State University. I was a landscape contractor major, and I studied business and horticulture. So that's where I received my degree, and I've never had another job. I've always worked at Kennedy's. I don't want to make this a Kennedy's advertisement, but I'm a big proponent of local businesses, and when you shop at a local store, you can get local advice, and advice that is customized to this area and also to your garden. The way cameras have changed the way we do things, we can see pictures instantly of people's properties and help them solve problems right away. I had a customer today that was literally drawing in the sand at the store, and we don't do that anymore. We don't do that very often because technology has made things so much easier. But it is Kennedy's is a beautiful place to work. We are right on the North River here, so it's a nice spot. We have a nice breeze in the summer when it gets hot. We have a lot of plants. We're very diverse. It's a nice place. This is a picture of when we were more of a farm, and we had a high percentage of the plants were actually in the ground. And it's kind of hard to imagine going to a garden center now and your plants would be in the ground and you have to come back at a later date after we dig them up for you. But that's the way it was back in the day. Things have evolved a little bit more. Our name is still difficult to say. My email address is very long, but Kennedy's Country Farm Gardens Nurseries was even longer back then. We've simplified it a little bit more these days. And as you can see in the sign, mums are no longer 95 cents. And I'm sure those shrubs were a lot cheaper back then as well. But things are evolving, and hopefully things are a little bit easier nowadays and you have more selection. So that's what we look like from the street nowadays. And another shot from above. And we're fortunate to have 4 greenhouses, heated greenhouses, which makes us a little bit unique in the area. Lots of color. This time of the year, the greenhouses are filling up. It's so exciting. I'm stuck in the office a lot, but I get to run down and see what came in today and help unload some plants and price things and water. And it's fun to see all the color that's rolling in here. This is our perennial department. We have a huge selection of perennials. And as the season changed, so do we. This is what we look like in the fall. We do a lot with mums and pumpkins. And then again, we have a big Christmas thing. So we have lots of fun here. It is fun. The seasons change, and we embrace that as much as we can. There are challenges, but it's mostly fun. We have a few pets, and we are pretty known for Tigger the cat, he has to be on at least his 9th life by now. He's up there in age, but he's still a great cat. And we have Marty the bird. Most people are familiar with that, and our fish. And we've had goats here. It is a lot of work behind the scenes. It's me pushing some plants in the background and trying to make the front of the store look good. It is a wild ride working in a garden center because of the seasonality of our business. The fact that almost everything we sell is perishable, and everything needs to be watered and cared for on almost a daily basis. So it is a challenge. It is a wild ride. And when we have 20 plus employees, many of them are new every spring. We're fortunate to have so many people that have worked for us for so many years and several for decades, but it is quite an undertaking every spring to try to pull everything together. And also all the plants start to arrive, and then all the customers and the phone and everything else all happens at the same time. So we certainly are balancing a lot in the spring, but we wouldn't have it any other way because it's such a pretty time, and it is exciting. Of course, last year we had a pandemic that started in March, and we didn't know if we were going to be in business. It was probably the most stressful 2 weeks of my career doing this since the mid 90s. We had word that Pennsylvania garden centers were not going to be allowed to be open, and we were getting word that Massachusetts was about to make a decision on whether garden centers would be ruled essential. So we were just trying to do our best just to keep our employees safe and any customers that wanted to come in, or we were trying to figure out ways to do an online store. We had never really done that in any significant way. We were trying to offer delivery and curbside pickup. Now, as you can imagine, how busy we get in the spring, trying to pick out everyone's pansies in every color and all the different quantities and the sizes, it was a lot of work, and it was not really sustainable for us to go through the spring and do anywhere near the amount of business we normally would do by doing just curbside. So we were fortunate enough to have the ear of Governor Baker. It just so happens to be that I was previously president, so it was my dad, of the Massachusetts Nursery and Landscape Association, and one of the people that used to sit on the board with me used to own a garden center, and he was picked to be the Commissioner of Agriculture. So the Commissioner of Agriculture in Massachusetts is a former garden center owner, and he was able to get the word to the people in charge that garden centers were indeed essential. And that really made or break, that was a make or break thing for garden centers to be ruled essential. We were basically ruled as home improvement, but I think most of us, and I think many people that are on the Zoom right now would agree that there are a lot of other physical and mental positive reasons for a garden center to be open, and the role that plants and gardening have in all of our well-being. People were stuck inside, and we all have been stuck inside, and especially this winter. And everybody wants to be outside right now. We want to get away from these Zooms, and we want to be in the yard, in the garden, in nature. And there's no better way to do that than doing some form of gardening, whether it's yard work, whether it's planting pots on your deck, or whether it's doing a vegetable garden for the first time. So we were deemed essential, and we have been told over and over how important plants are and garden centers. And it was so nice to see that, because we had incredible sales this past spring, and we didn't know if we were even going to be open. And it turns out we were not only open, but we had the best year we've ever had. And it's really across the board with all garden centers, and anyone in the home improvement field has really thrived during this, during the pandemic. And of course, it makes us feel almost guilty because so many businesses have not done well, the restaurant industry among them. And, we're trying to capitalize the best we can during this period, because we know everyone is dying to go on vacation, and they're probably going to leave their homes and forget about some of the things that they did in the garden. So we are trying to capture one more spring before things go back to kind of normal. But I don't know how much normal is going to be. I have a feeling that some of these things are going to stick around. I think some of these meetings that we're doing are going to be Zooms, and we can get more attendance as this is showing. We're probably going to continue to develop our online store and our delivery and possible curbside pickup types of things. So we are actively expanding our online store and making it as convenient as possible for people to be able to get their hands on plants and be able to do garden projects and just get outside. So I am curious if anybody knows what two departments are thriving the most in the garden center business. And I say this because, and you're welcome to put it in the chat, and I'll tell you what, I have a picture of an osteospermum in the, I don't know, I think you can see the plants in front of me, but there's a picture of an osteospermum, which is the little spoon flower. You see those little flowers? With my virtual background, it might be tricky, but I have this picture on the screen, and the people who answer that, the first few people that answer that correctly, we can give you a Cape Daisy or osteospermum. So what categories have thrived the most? And I will tell you that some of these categories have doubled, tripled, or quadrupled, and not just in Massachusetts, but also across the country. And it does have a lot to do with the pandemic. There are other factors involved as well. And as we continued through last spring, we found that supply was a problem. A lot of the greenhouses in nurseries and so forth had cut back, anticipating that some garden centers would be closed. So they didn't grow as many plants. So when we went to reorder and we sold out of certain things, we couldn't get them. And some nurseries were dipping into next year's crops to sell us trees and shrubs last year. So we are a little bit concerned about supply for next year. So, I mean, for this year. So we think we'll have enough color, because I think the greenhouses have actually upped their supply this year in anticipation that everyone was going to be home again this year, and there's this excitement. But we may be behind on some plants that take several years for them to grow. The Christmas tree industry, for example, has been, the demand has been higher than the supply the last few years. And last year, with everyone home, a lot of people wanted a real live tree. So now there's probably going to be a shortage for a few years because of that reason. So there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes, and I just thought I'd give you a little bit of insight into what's going on. I just mentioned the shop local thing at the bottom there, because it's so important to support our local businesses. And I am happy if a few dollars that you might normally spend in the garden might go to a restaurant or another local business that didn't do as well, because we almost feel guilty we did so well last year. But one of the nice advantages of having a good year is we'll be able to do some renovations, improve some of our facilities, our parking. It might make it easier for us to pay for education, training employees, and maybe repairing greenhouses or putting all new greenhouses up. So we have some big plans. It's really exciting, and I'm happy to be able to share all that. So in terms of a presentation or having some information to share, I just wanted to go through a few things. But in terms of gardening, some things stay the same. When it comes to any type of garden, putting the right plant in the right place is the key. And to be able to do that, you have to go back to nature and figure out where plants come from without going into a big, long history. It is good to know where plants like to be planted. So many people come into a garden center and they plant plants, or they ask for plants to be located. They want to buy a plant that they want to put in a place where it doesn't want to be. So we have to think like the plant, and where is it going to be happy? And then do we have a place in your yard to place the plants? So if we can think in the direction and think in lines of what the plant wants, then we're in much better shape. So in this particular property in Cohasset that I had the awesome responsibility to put together, as you can see behind the pool, there's a whole hillside that is shaded all afternoon. And those plants that I planted there are all plants that can take all that afternoon shade from the trees. The plants in the front side of the pool are all plants that can take sun all day long. And those are kind of much more hot, dry types of plants. So making sure you understand the conditions is number one. And our motto has always kind of been inspiring successful gardens since 1960. So I have always thought that success is the number one option. Short-term beauty is not as important as long-term beauty. And you want your plants to be sustainable and not just plants that you plant today and they last for a short amount of time. So I'm a big fan of trying to help people get their yards and properties looking good for the long term. Okay, so sunlight. We talked about that. There are three basic, and I'll try to go through this pretty quickly because I know we have kind of a clock ticking, but full sun basically means sun all day long, sun with no shadows. So many people tell me they want to plant in front of their house and they think it's full sun, and it actually is pretty shady. It doesn't mean that that's a bad thing. We just need to know which is which. So the trees, structures, buildings, they do shade the property for a period of time. South facing is usually full sun, which means the sun is coming from the opposite direction and beating on that area almost all day. The sun rises in the east over the ocean and sets in the west towards California. So if we can figure out what direction we're facing, it's a lot easier to place plants. And if we don't have full sun, usually it's part sun or part shade. Usually you get some sun in most of these gardens or areas where you want to plant, say, a vegetable garden or an ornamental garden. And knowing which time of day you get sun and shade is a huge factor. So the afternoon sun is hugely more bright and powerful. And if you were, for example, to plant a blue hydrangea, which so many people ask us for here in New England because they look so good along the coast and the Cape and the islands, blue hydrangeas just don't like afternoon sun. So an east-facing location is good because in the afternoon when the sun is on the west side of the house is actually blocking it, and hydrangeas do much better in those situations. They can also take filtered light through the trees. Morning sun is perfect for them. So if they get sun in the morning and then shade in the afternoon, that is ideal. The opposite condition is that hot afternoon sun. There are white hydrangeas that do a whole lot better in part sun, but they can take almost full sun. So just knowing that little bit of piece of information is good. And then of course, there's a whole another side to gardening, which is just pure shade gardening, which means that you often can't have as many colorful plants in terms of there's less plants that produce a lot of flowers and blooms. People show me pictures in magazines of plants and types of gardens they want to grow in the shade, and there's just it's just a different style in the shade. And the picture that I have shown here is more of a morning sun, afternoon shade facing garden, and there's more textures and colors with foliage that we work with. There are still some color in this garden, but it is more subtle usually. So that's one of the things we need to get used to with the shade. But there are spectacular plants that you can plant in the shade. You just have to be a little bit more, and we have to manage expectations. I hate that term, but it's true. We just have to kind of prepare people that you can't do the same things you can do in the sun. And if you go in that with the right mentality, then you're going to be in good shape. Soil conditions. This is huge. There are a whole bunch of, I could talk for 2 lectures on just soil, and I'll just try to keep this kind of brief, but soil is hugely important to growing plants. And there are all different types of soil conditions that you can come across. And there is the method of thinking that I learned in college, which had a lot to do with nutrients and soil testing and these very scientific, almost nerdy kind of numbers that you can get in a soil test. And there are some value to a soil test. But I find that most people who are gardening have a very large mix of plants. And not every plant wants to be treated the same way. So unless you're growing a particular crop or you have acres and acres of property where you're growing all one thing, and one example of that is a lawn. A lot of people have large lawns. And that's where taking a soil sample, a pH test, makes some sense because you want to get certain things in line. So your pH wants to be a little bit more alkaline for vegetable gardens, and for lawns, then it typically is a little bit more acidic in New England, and especially along the coast here. So there is a need sometimes to do a pH test, but I tend to simplify things a little bit more, and I can take a shovel and dig into someone's yard and have a pretty good idea how successful we're going to be with the types of plants we're going to plant. And usually I can tell more based on if it's sandy soil or clay soil, or you have a lot of organic material like the picture shows. And organic material like compost, and we all learn this if anyone's ever been to Holly Hill, and when my kids go there on a field trip, Farmer Johnny and all the folks there, one of the first things you learn is what compost is and how to do that. And it is an amazing thing, but it pretty much fixes almost everything in gardening and every soil problem. If you have sand, just like you were to go to the beach and you dig a moat, when you go to fill it with water, it always filters through and you have no more moat because you have to keep going back to the ocean to get the water because it's all sand. It just drains right through. That is really good and healthy for plants. It just doesn't hold much nutrients. It doesn't, if you look at the color, it's very light in color. And if you look at the color of compost, it's very rich in nutrients and living material that do really, really positive things for plants. The opposite is the case with clay. Clay is when you grab soil in your hand and you can see your fingerprints. You can shape it into things like pots. Clay is bad for plants because it does not let the water drain through, and plants can drown. So more likely, your plants will do better in sandy soil than they will in clay. But to fix either condition, adding compost, big bulky pieces of material that are rich in nutrients and have lots of beneficial microbes in it, is a good thing. So any kind of compost you can get your hands on is good. And we do recommend, you can buy it in a bag, you can buy it in bulk. We sell it at Kennedy's. Some of the other local places sell it. You can make your own. Like I said, we could do a whole presentation just on good soil and compost, but highly recommend to mix lots of organic material into any kind of new garden you start, whether it's a vegetable garden, whether you're planting a tree, dig a nice, big, huge, wide hole, take all the soil out and mix lots of compost in with it. You don't want to remove all of the soil and dig a hole and put just compost in it. You want to mix it about 50-50. There is some varying opinions about how much compost you use, how much you remove from a hole when you dig it. Basically, I say dig the hole as wide as you possibly can, mix in some good stuff with it, and you're going to probably fix most of your problems without having to do soil tests and get too overly technical. And again, getting back to if you have a very specific plant that you're planting lots of, like if you decide you want to open a cut flower garden and grow 1,000 peonies, then that might be something where you're going to do a pH test, do a soil test, and have someone educated look at those tests and give you some advice. Okay, in terms of our zones, with global warming, it does appear that we're getting a little bit warmer and we're allowed to grow some plants that we can't normally plant. I'm sure some of the ladies here in the garden club have experimented with some plants. I know in front of the Congo Church down in the common, there is a crepe myrtle that comes into bloom at the end of the summer. And it is a gorgeous plant. That is not normally a plant we can grow here. But as you see in the Massachusetts zone, if you can see that, you can see we're in that kind of limey green color. And we're considered sometimes 6A, 6B, or 7A. I think 6B is the most accurate designation. And we are right on the coast in Cohasset, as close to 7A as you can get, because the ocean keeps us warmer in the wintertime. It also keeps us cooler in the spring and in the summer. So right now, our forsythias will not come into bloom as quickly as say they will in Hopkinton. So when they run the marathon, usually around this time of year, we can see the forsythias in bloom at the start of the marathon, but they're not in bloom at the end of the marathon, or daffodils or things like that. So you can kind of see how that works. But from a hardiness perspective, one of the reasons why we can grow hydrangeas more successfully than you can, say, in Hopkinton or some of the more western towns, is because we stay warmer in the wintertime. So 6A or 6B are plants that you want to look for when you're shopping for plants. You can take chances on 6B or 7A plants, but they're not as reliable. So the lower the number, the more likely they will live here, if that makes sense. And as you can see on the bigger map, zone 10 and 11 are down in Florida, and zone 1 and 2 would be, say, up in Canada or Alaska, something like that. So hopefully that makes sense. Any questions so far, Gail? Anything that we need to address?
I don't see any questions. There are a lot of responses to your plant giveaway there.
All right. We'll be giving away some plants, I think, today.
Yeah, no questions just yet.
Okay, that's great. Okay, wind, sun, and winter wind and sun and snow cover, and how that affects plants. This is a picture of a garden I planted at the Scituate Harbor Yacht Club. And almost everything in this garden is either an annual, perennial, ornamental grass, things that go dormant in the wintertime. This is a very sunny and windy and seaside type location, about 300 feet to the left. There's a building a little bit there, but 300 feet to the left is Scituate Harbor. So it's pretty wide open. And if I planted a whole bunch of big evergreens there, or rhododendrons or azaleas, things like that, they wouldn't do very well, because the wind and the salt and the sun take the moisture and rob it from the leaves all winter long. And then come spring, it's a race to see if the plant can replace the moisture before it desiccates and the leaves just curl up and die. So you will see a lot of rhododendrons that have like curled edges and things like that near the ocean, or anywhere it's really windy and sunny, or it had gone through a little bit of drought in the fall. So choosing your plants wisely in sunny, windy conditions is important. I mentioned snow cover. Snow cover actually helps plants. It insulates the roots. It minimizes the freezing and thawing that happens in the wintertime that causes problems. So I mentioned deciduous versus evergreen. Deciduous means that those are plants that kind of go dormant in the winter and lose all their leaves, or like perennials, they almost die to the ground and their roots stay alive and then they come back next year. Ornamental grasses are the same category. Evergreens are plants that keep their leaves and their needles year round, and there are big degrees of separation on what evergreens are more tolerant to tougher conditions than others. And that's certainly something we can talk about. As you can see in the middle photo, and I don't know how well you can see the screen, but the rhododendron here has a lot of brown in the foliage. It's a beautiful flower, but you can see some of the brown in there. And that's kind of normal for rhododendrons to get some of that, but the more sun and wind they're exposed to, the more of that you're going to see. But the good news is I can see as the flower is coming out, so is the new growth, and they're going to get all new leaves, and that's very normal. And if you see rhododendrons that have a lot of broadleaf evergreens that have a lot of brown in them, you can pick off the worst leaves if you want. It makes it more aesthetically pleasing to you. It doesn't affect the plant so much, but it does help our own psyche and psychology. So sometimes it's better just to remove some of those leaves, and the new ones will replace it this spring. So the sign that new growth is really what you're looking for anything that doesn't look good from last year. And you got to remember also, we had a huge drought last summer, and a lot of plants, I'm driving around town, I see a lot of arborvitaes that have turned brown, and it's hit or miss, but there could be 2 or 3 in a row of 10. And it's often the ones that are furthest from the hose that didn't get quite as much water last summer. And evergreens are very similar to, say, a Christmas tree. When you cut the Christmas tree down, the Christmas tree looks good for maybe 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks. Some Christmas trees stay green for months, but they eventually start to turn brown. And some of that damage was done last summer when we had that pretty extreme drought, and we've had a couple of them in the last 10 years. So I find that your needly evergreen kind of to the right, this is some type of black or Austrian pine with a really thick, almost plasticky kind of a needle. they tolerate wind and sun and drought very well because it's almost like a waxy coating that's on the leaf. The boxwood and the rhododendron and the azaleas and mountain laurel and andromedas and those what they call broadleaf evergreens, they're evergreens that have round leaves on them all winter. Those suffer in the more wind and the more sun. So try to pay attention to that when you're choosing plants in your yard. And of course, we're always willing to help you. I'm sure any local garden center would be willing to help you figure that out. Growth rate. This is another thing that we help people with on a regular basis. This green giant hedge that's St. Anthony's Church behind that we planted a couple of years ago on Summer Street. And these are green giants that grow 1 to 2 feet per year. There is a hedge all around Paul Pratt Memorial Library that Gail probably sees every single day. She can probably look out the window and see them now. And there's some along the back. They get super tall. They start to get wide as they get older, but they grow really fast. We tell people 1 to 2 feet a year. The emerald green arborvitae to the right is a different type of arborvitae in the same family, but it grows much slower and is much skinnier. So for very narrow properties, we recommend the emerald green arborvitae. But if you want screening in a hurry, the green giant makes a ton of sense. You really need to think about the shape and how long you're going to be in the property and how quickly you need to have your privacy, or when you're selecting any kind of plant. When you look at the tags or you look online to see how big plants get, they will often give you a size. And I think the size is misleading. I think you use it as a guide to say, oh yes, I could see a green giant arborvitae get 40 feet tall, and I probably won't see an emerald green arborvitae more than 15 feet tall. But there are green giants in the world that are probably 100 feet tall, and there are emerald greens that are probably 30 feet tall. So it's just used as a guide to give you an idea, but growth rate is the most important thing. So if you're going to be in the house for 10 years and it grows 2 feet a year, it's going to be 20 feet taller. So you almost have to look at the rate more than you have to look at what it says on the tag. There are a handful of plants that stop growing, but almost everything grows forever. So perennials kind of max out a little bit. Hydrangeas kind of max out a little bit, but for the most part, most trees and shrubs and evergreens grow forever until something in nature, takes it down, or a storm, or there's an insect or a disease or something like that. So something to keep in mind. Another thing I like to mention to people is the shape in which plants grow becomes so important to what you are trying to accomplish. So this is just one plant called boxwood, which many of you are familiar with. It's an amazing plant. It's very reliable. It makes it through the winters here in this area very well, if it's situated in a good place. The plant all the way in the bottom left-hand corner goes straight up and down. It's a boxwood called Graham Blandy, and the one above it is a boxwood called D. Runk. They both get a whole lot taller than they get wide. I like the straight up and down one in very certain situations to the right of a front door where you have steps, but you have a window that's very close to the front steps, but you want kind of a formal entranceway kind of plant that will do it. If you planted the D. Runk or the one in the middle called Green Mountain at the bottom, they get fat at the bottom, and then I find it's actually interfering with the stairs or you entering the house, which drives you crazy if you plant it too close. And if the window is close to the steps, there's just not enough room to plant some other plants. So knowing the shape, the natural shape, is important to choosing the plants. The one all the way to the right is called Barter Valley, and it grows wider than it grows tall. And the one in the top right is Green Velvet. It's just your typical round green one. Everybody asks me, and I can embarrass Christine Wersky because her house is on Ripley Road, not far from the library, almost diagonal. And it has the slate roof with the green boxwoods across the front. And so many customers ask me about her house because the green velvet boxwoods she has are spaced out about 5 feet apart with perfect round balls that are shaped. and they always look fantastic. So knowing what the plants do and what their natural shape is. Now, I have seen people prune the round green velvets to pyramids, and I've seen people prune the middle one called Green Mountain into round balls, but it's a lot easier to let them grow into that shape, and there's a lot less work and a lot less pruning if you pick those. I also like to mention when I mentioned boxwoods, there's another plant called Japanese holly that gets confused with boxwoods, and they grow 2 times faster, sometimes more. And they're good if you want to screen the neighbor or have plants that grow fast because you're going to sell your house and you really want plants that will look more mature. But if you want plants to last a super long time and you don't want to replace them every so many years, boxwoods are your friend because they grow a lot slower. So it's a very popular plant. And that's a boxwood I planted here on the Summer Street property. And I used, it's hard to see, but I used 3 spruces this is the really sunny side of the house. And those spruces are needly plants that take the sun really well, and they thrive in that location. And of course, they provide a lot of color without having to plant a lot of flowers. So I like that plant for that reason. And some of our design tips and thoughts is that odd numbers are usually a good way to go unless you are doing an entranceway type of a thing or you're doing some kind of formal garden where sometimes pairs come in more handy. But most times we work in odd numbers, and some form of a triangle is often used when we're doing design. Also, looking back on many of the different designs over the years that I've done for customers, back when I did them 20 years ago, and you drive by and you say, oh, what was I thinking? Why did I use that plant? Or why did I do it that way? I think one of the urges we all have is we want to collect plants. We want one of everything. We fall in love. We go to a garden center. We have no plan. We just buy everything. Well, that is more of a collector's garden, and one of everything sometimes can look good if you really know what you're doing, but it is actually much harder. And I think massing plants, putting 3s and 5s and 7s and 9s, you don't always have to stay with odd numbers. People don't count as much once you get above 7, but when you do things in masses, when they come into bloom, for example, azaleas or weigela or some plants that really have gorgeous flowers, when you plant multiples of them, they really start to show up. When you have 3 different three of the same plant in 3 different colors, it just kind of looks a little busy and might not be as pleasing to the eye, especially if you're walking by or driving by at a faster clip. So think about massing your plants and making some decisions and not buying one of everything if you can resist the urge. But I know a lot of you garden club ladies, you collect your plants like I do, and your yard looks more like a collector's garden, and that's fine. You kind of learn a lot of lessons. And, I encourage people to experiment, have fun. Don't always plant, you don't have to follow all the rules. You can make mistakes. You can move plants. You can prune. You can do all kinds of things. The other thing I wanted to mention was changes of grade. A lot of projects we work on are very flat spaces, and anytime you can add soil and rocks, and if you have a property that has a lot of ledge, that can be very challenging, but it can also be really cool to work with the ledge and work with the different heights and grade changes and add walls and hardscapes and things like that. It can be really fun. And sometimes I purposely dump a truckload of soil and just spread it around and make different heights and levels. So don't be afraid to experiment with that if you're creating a brand new garden. I always try to make sure too that the water drains away from houses, because you don't want the water pooling up near your house or in your basement. So try to grade everything away from your house if you have a blank slate to work with. I just showed a picture of the house. A friend of mine, I helped him landscape his house, and we lit up his garden after we were done, and I just find it's the coolest thing. I've lit up all the trees at my house. I'm doing it at our store now. I just think lighting your trees at night looks so spectacular, and anytime you can put a light on something that you're so proud of, the tree that you planted that is now, beautiful, why not enjoy it at night? Especially when you work a long day and you come home, you want to see your plants. So highly encourage people to light up their gardens. Work with a designer. Don't be afraid to ask for help. My wife and I have asked plenty of interior designers for help inside our yard, and sometimes people think, well, everyone can do landscaping, but hire a designer, hire some help, ask questions, read the tags. Online shopping can be really scary. We have, like I said, an online store. We have a partner that sells trees online. I find people make so many mistakes when they don't ask questions. They just buy plants. So definitely take your time, do it right. Don't be in a rush, and have a little bit of a plan. You make a lot less mistakes that way, if you can. But you know, experimenting is still part of the fun. So you got to do a little bit of that, especially with color and smaller plants where the mistakes are not as costly. I just want to mention that a garden, in my opinion, is never done. I'm never satisfied with any garden I've ever done. I always think there's more we can do. There's more tweaks. I think we could move a plant over here. So don't feel like you're going to plant your garden and it will be done forever. If you embrace it and you like to garden, then you look forward to the changes and how plants grow. It's a real challenge working with plants. Unlike an interior designer, the things we use to design with change shape, they change size. And it's a super big challenge, but it also makes things fun. And it's why we kind of are always reaching for the carrot as gardeners. So I just wanted to mention, you can email me. These are pictures from my garden. Hopefully someday I can show it to you. Gail and I talked about potentially maybe doing a follow-up either in my garden or doing a tour, or maybe I could do a Zoom for my garden someday. But this is some of my favorite plants and some of my favorite things to look at. So if we have questions, I'd be happy to take a few, or we want to if we want to look at the chat.
We do have some questions.
Okay.
Let me get.
Should I answer? Should I answer the question?
Dee Dee would like to know, when can I plant Montauk daisies?
Okay. So this is funny because I'm getting some help with marketing because I can't get to everything. And I mentioned to the lady helping me, I said, we need to answer the question very quickly about what can be planted now, because it's a super common question in the month of April. As the weather gets warmer, there are more and more things we can plant in the garden. Our rule at Kennedy's, and this is the case with a lot of garden centers, is if it is outside, you can plant it now. And if we have it, you can plant it, because if I don't have it, you can't plant it, or unless you can get it from a friend. But anything that is intended to be outside, like a perennial, a tree, a shrub, a grass, if it is available to dig up from a friend's yard, or it is available at a local garden center, you can plant it. So there's no hesitation now. However, plants that are inside a greenhouse, things that we might be keeping in the greenhouse include many herbs and veggies. Like lettuces can go outside, but you can't put basil outside. You can put pansies outside now, but you can't safely put petunias and say impatiens outside. All your tropicals and houseplants, things like that, cannot go out yet. The threat of frost in New England is usually somewhere around mid-May, give or take. So try to resist the urge to take tropical or sensitive plants from the inside to the outside. But when you're shopping, if you can follow the rule, if it's outside, chances are it can go outside.
Thank you. So there's another one. Elaine would like to know, why was last year's blue hydrangea season so lush compared to the prior summer?
That is a great question, and it's the most asked question we have in the garden center is basically questions about hydrangeas. And the answer is a mild winter is your friend here, and the more mild we have it and the more snow that we have to insulate the roots and the stems of the hydrangea, the better. This was, I think, the best hydrangea year that we've seen, and it was really across the board. It was almost every garden I went to, people's hydrangeas were blooming, and we hardly had people asking us the question, why doesn't my hydrangea bloom? I'm so frustrated. And if your hydrangea didn't bloom last summer, then chances are you have a variety that is somehow sterile or just not good. A lot of the newer varieties of hydrangeas are being advertised to be remontant or blooming on new wood. So if a husband or a spouse accidentally prunes it back, or we get a super cold winter and it dies back, you still get flowers. We're still trying to figure out what the best hydrangeas are, but there are some really good ones. One's called Blue Jangles, which is a new dwarf one from Proven Winners. The Endless Summer line of hydrangeas, almost everything in there, Bloomstruck seems to be the best one for reliability on bloom. It has a little bit of a fungus issue we're starting to see now that it's been out a few years, but it is the most reliable one that I have seen, and it's a deep blue or a deep pink. So good question.
All right, on to the next one. Marissa asks, we have a lot of moss on our rocks and parts of our lawn. Can moss affect our plants and garden?
So the moss does not affect the plants in the garden. It usually just is opportunistic. So it's trying to take advantage of empty spaces, either in your yard, in your lawn, or in your gardens. And it's not a bad thing. And I have people that literally dig it up and put it in other places because they like it so much. It can tolerate conditions that some plants don't tolerate. Lawns, for example, don't grow well near the roots of trees, especially surface rooted trees like maple trees. And often the soil near maple trees is compacted if there's been any kind of foot traffic, and moss will grow there and lawns won't, no matter what you do. You can, and I have customers, and there are plenty in Cohasset that are willing to spend the money. They rip up the moss, they put new grass seed, they put new loam down, and every single year they just are determined to grow seed. And you can get seed to grow on just about anything, so it will grow there temporarily, but long term it won't. So moss is easy to remove with a rake. You can just scrape it up and put some new seed down, but chances are it's telling you that there's another reason why you're having the moss. So it's usually compacted soil. It might be too much shade, too many roots from trees. It could also be that you just need to like pull some plugs and aerate your soil, and maybe add a little bit of lime to counteract the soil acidity.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Val asks, when should I divide my perennial grasses?
Now, perfect time to cut your grasses way back. I hear all kinds of techniques on that, from Velcro pruners by hand to electric gas powered shears. I've heard of people using chainsaws to cut them down, and then to try to dig up the clumps and divide them. The early spring is the best before they start to grow, because you won't injure the plant at all. And you can divide it into pieces, and you'll make lots of friends. When you think about grasses, and I don't want to tell this in front of everybody, so keep this a secret, but at $35 a grass for a 3-gallon pot, you might be able to share them with your friends and not buy them at the garden center, but that's really hurting me, so I won't say that out loud. But your grasses should be divided maybe every 2 to 4 years, something like that. And you can dig them up and make friends, or plant them in areas. Most grasses like a lot of sun. The mistake most commonly made is people plant them in the shade because they want to screen something or screen a neighbor, and then they don't do as well. So just make sure you have a lot of sun. And I use a really sharp blade, like a straight shovel. We call it, we use it as like an edging spade, but some people use a Sawzall blade, a fine-tooth Sawzall blade, and they cut them into pieces. That's a good way to divide them if you're looking for a tip and a trick.
All right, we have 3 more questions, and then we'll get to your trivia answer.
Okay, cool.
All right, so let's see. Alice asks, how can I transplant small holly trees successfully?
Small holly trees. Okay. Hollies are generally considered shallow-rooted plants and easy to transplant. The reason why it's good to transplant now is that you're going to damage the roots of any plant you transplant. It's hard to dig anything up without damaging the roots. But the goal is to get as much of the root ball as you can in as much soil, because that's what keeps the roots moist. But because it's usually damp now, we usually get a lot of April showers, and it's usually cooler, cloudy, or overcast this time of the year. So it's a good time to move things. And if the roots are damaged, it hasn't put out its new growth yet. And the new growth needs water to make it grow. And if the new growth comes out first and then you damage the roots, the new growth can shrivel up and die. And sometimes it causes a lot of stress. And some of the older leaves start to fall on your plants too. So most plants you would want to divide before the leaves come out on the trees is basically the general rule. So if you look up and you don't see leaves in the trees, it's usually a good time to divide. The plants we usually recommend not to dig up and in perennials to not divide are things that bloom in the spring. So usually irises and peonies are two popular plants that people dig up, transplant, and divide. And we usually recommend to wait till August to do those. But it's a small list of plants. Most things, when in doubt, go ahead and transplant them when they're dormant, which is now.
Thank you. Sue asks, my yard is often exposed to flooding from brackish water. Can you recommend salt-tolerant plants?
Yeah, that will be an offline question, I think, but because it's a very specific thing. But salt water is one of the things that is very difficult, and it varies from year to year. If you come across the situation, we usually recommend irrigating the area quite a bit to try to leach as much of the salt out as possible, because it usually happens in the wintertime more likely, whether you have the bigger tides, and using some gypsum, which helps with anybody in this talk that might have poorly drained soil. Gypsum is something that helps open the pores of the soil to let water go, drain well, and also it pulls away some of the excess salt or nutrients that we may not want to linger around. And then we're going to need to choose plants wisely, but often what does best are plants that grow natively along the seaside. So Berberis roses, ornamental grasses, things like that. I usually recommend not spending a ton of money buying high valued plants in situations that get flooded, because you're probably going to lose them somewhere down the line.
All right. And the last question is from Alice. A neighbor planted an arborvitae hedge and deer eat the bottom 5 feet of the hedge. The deer
Right.
also eat my rhododendron plants. What plants are deer resistant? And the second part of the question is, when should rhododendron plants be trimmed? Can a significant amount be trimmed without damaging the plant?
Okay, and what plant was that, rhododendrons?
So the first part was about what plants
Right.
are deer resistant, and the second
Right.
plant was should rhododendrons be trimmed?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So that's a great question. We have a link on our website. I believe it's either Maryland or Rutgers University. I can't remember, but they rank all of the plants based on never damaged, seldom damaged, almost all the time damaged plants. And they do them in categories. It's not perfect because they're a little bit more south of here, but the list is pretty accurate. I recommend that handout, that link, highly, and it should be on the garden info page on our website. I think if you go under plants and then, let's see, I can look at my website really quickly. Plants, and then garden info links. And it should be under there, yeah, deer resistant plants. And I believe it's Rutgers. And that's a great resource. But yes, I mentioned green giant arborvitaes and emerald green arborvitaes, and emerald greens get eaten by deer and green giants do not. And I tend to steer people towards green giants almost every single time for that reason. And for example, rhododendron will be eaten, but not an Andromeda, which is also called Pieris. So choosing these plants wisely is hugely important. More and more suppliers of garden centers are adding that information on the tag, but coming in armed with your list when you're shopping is a great idea. Also asking people like us to help you with that is super important. Oh, and the pruning part. If you're going to prune a plant that has a lot of leaves, like an evergreen has a lot of leaves, the best time to prune it is now before the leaves come out. So before the plant expends any energy on growing, you want to cut it back. And the harder you cut it back, the worse the plant is going to look. So you're going to have to bear with it. If you cut 90% of the leaves off, you're going to look at a lot of sticks. I've heard of people cutting rhododendrons back a third and half or all the way to the ground, and they eventually usually do come back. the further you cut it back, the worse they look, and the more likely that it's a little bit higher risk that they won't come back, or you won't have the patience to wait for them to come back. So that's the trick. Now, some people I recommend to dig up the plant and move it, because if it's too big now, chances are it's going to be too big again in the near future, and you're always going to be battling this problem. So keep that in mind.
All right, so that concludes our questions.
Okay.
Now
So
to the trivia.
My quiz answers were, in our garden center, people were flooding in to buy edible plants, anything that had herbs, vegetables, fruits, fruit trees, blueberries, raspberries, things like that. Our numbers were double what they were the year before. And the thought process amongst our industry is that half of the people that started a vegetable garden last year during the pandemic with their little kids or family, or just because they were bored and they needed to get out away from the screen, if half of those people come back next year, then we'll have a lot more gardeners just amongst us, which I think is a wonderful thing. It's a great hobby. It's a great thing to be addicted to if you're addicted to it, compared to a lot of other things. So we're happy about that, because a lot of people say that the gateway plant to gardening is a vegetable plant. So we're hoping that trend continues. The other department that seems to be going gangbusters is related to the state of Florida. There is not a houseplant to be found in Florida. Every garden center across the country that has a greenhouse that sells houseplants is selling everything that they can get their hands on. It is every age bracket, but it is really interesting to see that young people, people that do not have children particularly, are plant parents. Parenthood is a thing. And in their apartments and in their new houses, before they have kids, people are buying plants left and right, and they're collecting them, and they're building whole walls full of plants. And houseplants is a major thing, and it is transformed even to my house. I've never been a houseplant person. I've always been an outdoor plant person. But my wife is reminding me that she keeps finding more and more plants around our house that she needs to water while she's home doing her Zoom calls and I'm doing mine from work. She's watering the plants. So if you see my wife around town, you might be able to relate to some of this. But it's a cool thing, I think, for everything. And it is a trend. I don't know if it will last forever, but a lot of these plants were popular back in the 60s and 70s, and they're back, and it's kind of almost like a retro thing. So it's fun to see.
All right. So let's see.
So Gail, we can hook up afterwards, and I'll try to coordinate with some folks that answered that question, right? Maybe we can get them a few free plants.
Yes. Can I give out your email address?
Absolutely.
So if anybody has any specific questions that they'd like to ask Chris, you can contact him at Chris at Kennedy's, that's plural, Kennedy'sCountryGardens.com. Kennedy'sCountryGardens.com.
That's it.
All right. I want to thank everyone for coming this evening and sharing this this wonderful outdoor scenes with Chris. And I want to thank Chris. And I also want to thank the Community Garden Club of Cohasset. This has been an enjoyable experience. I think it all invigorates us to get out there in the dirt and start planting.
Absolutely. Happy spring, everybody.
Happy spring, everyone. Thank you.